But we don't only cook foods. We do something else completely different with foods that no other animal does. And that is that we combine foods. And the reason that we do this is very clear, in the same way that the reason that we do most things with food is very clear. It's about economics. It's about filling up your children, filling up yourself so that you can go to work, so that your children aren't pestering you, so that you can go and earn money, la la la. It's about creating space in diets that you don't or cannot eat. And the best way of putting this in is to say that when you eat sugars, your body associates sugars with fruit, because that's where you were getting your sugars from for 120 million years. And your whole digestive system is designed to be optimized to consume one type of food at a time. Our closest relatives all do the same thing, and almost all mammals do the same thing. They land on a tree of oranges and they just eat oranges. And their system is completely optimized to just eating oranges at that moment. And then they all fall asleep. They're so happy they fall asleep. And then they wake up 2 hours later and they wander off to the walnut tree. And they just eat walnuts. And then they finish with those and they go off and eat a certain type of leaf. This mixing of foods is a completely human phenomenon. And when they are eating oranges, they're only eating oranges. So their fat assimilation systems, their dense protein assimilation systems in the bowel are offline, they're asleep, they're rejuvenating. And their sugar assimilation systems are bang on. And then they move to the walnut tree, and their protein assimilation systems in the stomach, their fat assimilation systems in the liver come online, and their sugar assimilation systems go offline. Everything's working while something else is sleeping. It's being optimized. And so when you eat sugars, your body tastes fruit. And fruit has some very specific properties to it. It is very easily digested. It has a massively high water content, it has vitamin content, it has mineral content, and it has major sugar content. It has very low protein content, very low fat content on the whole. And that's fine whilst you're eating sugar. Everything is designed around it. And then you mix sugars with starches, for example, in the way that we do. This chart is in your books, incidentally. Starches require the secretion of an enzyme in the mouth called ptyalin in order to break them down. If you don't secrete ptyalin into starches, they cannot be broken down as they pass through the bowel. They will not digest, they will ferment. Fermentation is the proliferation of detrimental bacteria and its byproducts, toxins, whereas digestion is the proliferation of beneficial bacteria and its byproducts, nutrients. Completely different. Same environment, same food, same temperature, same pH, different bacteria. Cruxal to this whole picture. And when you eat starches in combination with sugars, your body sees fruit. Because that's what it needs most of all, and that's what it tastes first of all. And your body optimizes towards digesting fruit. So it turns off the hydrochloric acid system in the stomach. You can't really be digesting proteins at the moment because there's no proteins in fruit. And it turns off, in this case, more importantly, the ptyalin secretion glands in the mouth. It inhibits the secretion of these amylytic enzymes that will break down the starches because it sees fruit. And so when you combine fruit, and when you combine sugars and starches, you cannot digest the starches because your body is optimizing for fruit. What you don't digest will ferment. When you combine sugars and proteins, you get a similar thing going on. Your body sees sugars, it inhibits the hydrochloric acid production in the system because it's optimizing for fruit, and so the proteins don't get their acid bath that they were designed to, or that your system was designed to give them. And so then they can't be chopped up as they go through the system. What doesn't digest will ferment. In this case it's called putrefaction, which is just another way of saying fermentation. So that doesn't work either. When we combine starches and proteins, there's no sugar in the system antagonising their digestion, but starches wants to get through to the small intestine so that the ptyalin that was produced in the mouth can work. It's an alkaline-based enzyme. Whereas proteins want to stay in the stomach in order to be digested in the acid bath in the stomach. So combining starches and proteins together means that neither one of them digests very well. So you get fermentation. fermentation is the proliferation of detrimental bacteria, shifts us from an 80% population of good bacteria to an 80% population of detrimental bacteria. This is the major means through which we have achieved the shift, and it doesn't work for us. It does mean that your digestive system will be very full, will be very backed up, because it's trying to process this indigestible combination. And that's what most of our traditional foods, which instantly break protein and starch rules straight off the bat, that's what most of them are trying to achieve. They're trying to fill us up so that we can go out to work, so that we can not have hungry children. If you've got an acre of land you will to grow your food from, you will plant the things that fill you up most. And you will eat them in combinations that fill you up most, because that's the most important thing to do. And so we end up with all traditional foods breaking at least these two rules, if not all three. Because the aim of this is to fill us up. But monkeys aren't interested in being full up. The digestive system of an ape, this digestive system, doesn't do that. It never has. Because it's never had any economic pressures. Food is dripping out of the trees all around it. It can constantly eat. And that's what the system is designed to do. But we need to fill it up in order to be able to fulfill this ridiculous economic pressure upon us, which is completely our invention. So this is a very different way of doing business. Name me some proteins.
Milk,
egg whites, beans, chicken breast,
lentils, tofu.
Pretty much covered them.
Pulses.
Yeah, legumes, pulses. Another one that most people don't really notice, nuts and seeds, and avocados.
Yes.
Avocados are one of the
Love
superfoods. They have the
They're
nutrient.
genuine superfood.
Absolutely. They have the vitamin and mineral spectrum of fruit and the fat and oil and protein spectrum of nuts and seeds. They're one of the major superfoods. Starches,
Potatoes.
rice.
with longing in her voice. What was the other one?
Pasta,
Which is made from?
grains.
Brains.
And that is about it. Not that many of them. One that people don't usually pick up on are peanuts. Peanuts are actually ground nuts. They're not a nut. They're a legume. They come from under the ground. They're a plant, the place where the plant stores its energy. So therefore, they're starch rich.
Is that why some people die when they eat peanuts because of the poisonous things in them?
We'll go there later. It launches me into a different subject that I haven't got time for right now.
Okay.
But we will go there if you remind me after this or tomorrow.
What's the word at the bottom after eggs?
Legumes. A starch that most people don't think of are bananas. Bananas, when they're in their green form, have about 40% starch in them. By the time they've got touches of brown on them, they're only about 10% starch, because a banana contains the enzymes that are necessary to break down its starches into sugars. That's why you can pick bananas green in the Grand Canaries and bring them here, and they ripen here. One of the few fruits that are actually happy to ripen off the tree, because they contain all of the compounds that they need to do so.
Does apple have starch in it?
Hmm?
Apple has starch in it?
Well, when we come to actually looking at the components of anything, they will all contain proteins, because all cells are made up of proteins. They will all contain sugars, because all cells run on sugars, and they will all contain some degree of starches. So actually this starts to be just a map of where we can plot things. So for example, sweet potatoes are fairly starchy, but they're also fairly sweet. And so they will probably go somewhere up there, sort of halfway between starchy and the sweet. But they're not so starchy that they go all the way into the corner and get forced out of the triangle into this list.
Cassava is very starchy, no?
Anything like that. It is fairly starchy, but it's also slightly sweet. It's sweeter than a potato. So it's cassava and yams and things like that are in that corner, but they're not quite as extreme. Sugars, the most obvious one is fruit, and anything that you suspect might have refined sugar in it is up there. But there's a whole cluster of things that we haven't mentioned here, which sit in the middle. Vegetable matter. And the reason vegetable matter sits in the middle is because it contains some protein, starch and sugar, but not enough to force it anywhere near any of these corners. And in doing so, it means that vegetable matter can be used as a buffer between proteins and starches. So if you want to continue to eat proteins and starches in the same meal, if you eat vegetable matter in there as well, then it lightens the impact of the collision, if you want to say it like that. So instead of eating 50% potatoes and meat, if you include a huge amount of vegetable matter in there, so there's only 30% vegetable, 30% meat, and 30% potato, 30% meat, and 40% vegetable matter, you've only got 30% of one and 30% of the other colliding. So you've got an easier meal to digest already. If you make that vegetable matter raw, then it brings in all kinds of enzymes with it and all kinds of fibrous material that lighten the impact of that again. So the first thing to note, the first thing to take away from this way of mapping foods is that if you eat any meal with a salad, by salad I don't mean lettuce and tomatoes, and never ever eat anything as dull as that. I mean anything in its raw form, then you can start to majorly alleviate the impact of this meal, which leaves you with infinitely more energy. Or you can do what I did when I first got into this way of eating, which was my first major step that made me realise how much energy there is available to you if you eat things differently. And that's why I present it, because it remains the single most impactful thing I've ever done with diet. More so than going completely raw. Food combining just propelled me, completely changed my whole relationship with food, because it made me realise that my sense of myself, my sense of my well-being, was hooked to what I eat. And if I change what I eat to work better, I feel much better. And that's why I present it, because it works like that. The way that I first started working with this was to go a bit more extreme with it, which was to have a protein day and a starch day. So in any one day I would eat fruit for breakfast, and it gets that out of the way. And then I would eat protein and vegetable matter for lunch, so eggs and salad. And then in the evening I would have protein and vegetable matter. So I would have meat and veggies. Whereas the next day I would have a starchy day. So I would have, I was in Taiwan, so it would be noodles and vegetables, or rice and vegetables. And so I separated the two things out completely. And I found out more recently, well, this was first popularised in the 80s as the hay diet, which interestingly, the first big hole punched in the side of the calorie argument, is that interestingly, you end up eating more food through this system. But it's a weight loss system, because calories have got nothing to do with weight loss as an essential part of understanding it. Toxin storage, or fat storage in the body is about toxin storage. And when you stop combining these things like this, you stop generating detrimental bacteria, you stop generating toxins that then don't need to be stored. So you start to lose toxins. But you end up eating more food, because this system was designed to fill you up. You stop doing that and you won't remain full. So you end up eating more food. So your calorie intake massively increases, but the weight falls away. It remains the single most tested and proven method of sustained weight loss. Slimming World or one of those guys still use the food combining system, their blue days and red days or whatever it is. So they've come to the same conclusions that I came to for the same reasons. It's easiest. Just separate it out by day. That's one way of dealing with it. You can use it in a different way, where you just add much more vegetable matter and less of these dense foods, and you start to feel that. It's fantastic, fantastic, simple thing to do with diet.
Food alongside hot food?
Absolutely, yeah, no problem there. The more raw food you've got in the system, the less combining matters. Because combining is a problem associated with cooked foods. You don't get nearly so many combination issues off of raw foods. So if you were to eat bananas and avocados, which I strongly suggest you do, sling 5 bananas and an avocado in a blender with a tablespoon of cocoa powder and you've got chocolate mousse of the highest order. But there's no combination issue there, because it's all raw. Don't get that big, heavy, weighty stuff. It's not meat and starch. It's not meat and chips. It's relatively light. It's just fruit.
Yeah, where does seaweed go?
Seaweed would be in the middle, in the vegetable column. Yeah. If you type food combining into the web, you'll come up with lots of different maps, because lots of different people have found out lots of different things since then. I deliberately present the sort of easy version, because if you make something too complicated, people don't do it, I find. So start with that and you'll find a massive change in how your food affects you. But the more raw you include in your diet, the less you need to think about it. It's worth noting. Well, if you mix fruit with foods, so the argument of having sweet foods after, having a sweet after a meal, and then better than that is to have fruit after a meal. It's better than eating, you know, cream pies after a meal, definitely. But you're still going to be creating some degree of combination issues, because your meal, if it was steak and chips, is in your stomach, and then you eat fruit, and the fruit wants to get through into the small intestines. It wants to digest very easily, so it will tend to sit on top of the other meal and do nothing at best, and ferment at worst. So it would be better to eat sweet things before the meal, because then they get ahead to where they want to go.
Or to eat fruit well after.
Or to eat fruit well aside.
How long would you give it?
Till you're hungry, which is inconceivable for most people.
Eat it first thing in the morning.
Well, that's what I found. That's always been my way of dealing with fruit. And that you get to this point at which, if you're actually feeding the body the sugars that it's looking for, so you're actually eating fruit, it doesn't come up as this constant craving throughout the rest of the day, because you're not constantly craving fruit. There's sufficient sugars in the system to run it, so the sugar urge goes away. But if you're eating sugars that don't really work for the system, then they don't get to the cells that are calling for them, and so the sugar urge remains. So you keep eating more and more and more sugars. So if you could satisfy the sugar urge, and the best time to do that is first thing in the morning, because you haven't got anything in the way disturbing its digestion, then it's done for the day. And so at the end of a meal, you don't then crave a sweet thing, because what that was telling you actually was that meal should have been a sweet thing, because there aren't enough of it in here. Yeah? So if you get that done already, then it's easy from there.
The beetroot is sugar, isn't it?
Hmm?
Beetroot.
Everything contains all of those compounds, but we have bred certain things, we have hybridised certain things to fulfil what we want them to fulfil taste-wise. And so beetroot and most carrots, even things like turnips and parsnips, are very sugar-rich these days because we've bred them to be so. Doesn't mean that we should or we shouldn't, but you're right, it's worth noting.
If you have raw and cooked on the same plate, I've heard the argument that you should eat the raw first. Is that
I've heard it both ways round, and I've never understood the arguments for either of them. I don't think it makes any difference. If you eat the raw first, then you are providing the enzymes necessary to digest the cooked. But if you eat the raw afterwards, then you're bringing in the fibre to push the cook through. So it's 6 of one, 9 dozen the other, I think.
going back to bananas, I've heard that because one of my family is diabetic, that we should eat bananas in the greener state than the more sugary.
Well, that would be to limit their body's inability to process the sugars.
But is it best to eat it when it's fully?
Everything when it's fully ripe. Yeah, as ripe as you can find them. And that's when they taste the sweetest and they're easiest to eat and they're most attractive. Well, that's a question of taste. Nikki has arrived.
Yeah, also what I meant was, is it okay to mix the fruit, like in a mixer, but not in the juicer? Because you told me.
I see. If you blend fruit, so you